Hey guys, it's me, Miss Benson. So this is going to be the solutions video to walk you through the Microeconomics Unit 3 practice FRQs that I gave you. Now these are actual FRQs from previous years. I just wanted to start off with some shorter FRQs instead of jumping maybe into a long one. So in this question you actually have a graph of a market, supply and demand, and we can tell that it's a tariff graph because it has something on the graph labeled a world price. That's going to mean that customers are able to find this item at a price that's lower in the world as opposed to paying a higher price in their own country domestically. Now the first part of this question says, identify the price and quantity if this country were just buying it domestically, if there was no trade going on. So this is just going to be normal equilibrium. So that's going to be P2 on this graph and Q2. Now the next part says, suppose that they're going to start opening their doors and they're going to start trading with the rest of the world and they're going to start importing oil from other countries. How much will they import? Remember that the reason why you want to buy things from other countries is because maybe you can't find enough stuff in your own country. If you go over and hit your demand curve, we see the quantity demanded at this price is Q3. So these domestic customers, they want Q3, that's the quantity they want, but they can only find Q1 in their country. This is a shortage. And what are they going to do to get the rest of what they're looking for? They're going to import whatever they're missing from other countries. So the import is going to be from Q1 to Q3. Part C asks about consumer surplus. Remember that consumer surplus is like customer savings. It's the difference between how much they're willing to pay for something, represented by the demand curve, and how much they actually have to pay for something, represented by the price line that they have to pay. Part C wants us to find consumer surplus before trade and after international trade. And it only wants us to use the letters that are going to outline the 3 points of the consumer surplus triangle. So before trade, people had to pay the normal equilibrium price of P2. So consumer surplus is going to be K, G, P2. Now when customers realize that they can trade and they can get this item at a lower price from other countries and other parts of the world, then when they're paying a lower price, as price falls, their savings or their consumer surplus is going to increase and get bigger. So at a world price of PW, consumer surplus is now K down to H over to PW. And you can see that consumer surplus has definitely gotten a lot bigger. In Part D, we have to do the same thing for producer surplus. Now, opening the doors to trade is not going to be very beneficial to producers because they're facing a whole bunch of competition from the rest of the world that they weren't facing before. Well, producer surplus before trade was at equilibrium. So at equilibrium price, that's going to be a triangle represented from P1, P2, over to G. But when we open our doors to trade and customers can buy this product for a much lower price, that means that all of these domestic sellers have to also lower their price if they want to try to compete with the rest of the world. Well, this means that these sellers aren't getting paid nearly as much for their product as they used to at equilibrium. So now producer surplus at a price level of PW is just going to be a smaller triangle at P1, PW, and J. Part E wants us to identify the net gain in total surplus from trade. Now, total surplus is all of the surplus that's happening to everybody in the market. Right now, there's not even a tariff on here. We're just talking about consumers and producers. The government hasn't even gotten involved. And so we're only going to add together consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So that whole area to the left of equilibrium is total surplus before trade. Now, after trade, our consumer surplus increases and it extends all the way to point H. Now there's a little space, J, G, and H, that extends beyond the boundaries of that stuff to the left of equilibrium. That's new surplus that's happening now that wasn't happening before the doors were open. So the net gain in total surplus is going to be J, G, H. So number 3, this next question deals with complementary goods. It also deals with price elasticity and total revenue. So it starts off by saying that bread and butter are complementary goods. This means that they are bought and used together, like a pair. It then goes on to say that the government is going to subsidize wheat, and that wheat is a resource into the production of bread. Now remember that subsidies are the opposite of taxes. Instead of the government taking some money away, a subsidy is where they're giving some money or giving a financial break. So a subsidy is always something that's a good thing that's meant to encourage production. So in part A, the first thing that it wants us to do is draw a graph of how this subsidy is going to affect the wheat market. All right, well, if the government is subsidizing the production of this wheat, that means that producers are going to be willing to produce a lot more to get this subsidy. So this is going to shift the supply curve of wheat to the right. That means that equilibrium price is going to fall and equilibrium quantity of wheat is going to increase. Part 2, we have to draw the effect of this on the bread market. Well, if wheat is cheaper and more available, then that means that the bread makers are going to be able to afford to buy more wheat, so they can afford to make more bread. So that is going to shift the supply of bread to the right as well. And that's going to also decrease equilibrium price for bread and increase the equilibrium quantity for bread. Well, if bread and butter are bought and used together, and bread just got cheaper in our last graph, then people are going to buy more bread and therefore they're going to buy more butter. So the demand for butter is going to shift to the right. When the demand for butter shifts to the right, this is going to increase equilibrium price of butter and increase the equilibrium quantity of butter. Now notice that this question asks you to show the effect. Please make sure on your graph you're doing dashed lines to the y and x axis to show the original equilibrium price and quantity and the new equilibrium price and quantity. Label that P1, P2, Q1, Q2. And the show part, the way you can show what's happening, draw those directional arrows. Actually draw an arrow from P1 to P2 to show what direction it's moving. And draw an arrow from Q1 to Q2 to show which way it's moving. Now part B is telling us the demand for bread is elastic. Well, if the demand for bread is elastic, we got to figure out what's going to happen to total revenue given what happened to our bread graph. On our graph we just drew for bread, the price fell. Remember guys, if you're in the elastic range and your price goes down, people are going to have a very strong reaction to that lower price and they're going to buy a lot more. So that's going to lead to an increase in total revenue. Remember we had that very handy graph where our demand curve was split into 3 sections: elastic up top, unitary in the middle, inelastic at the bottom. Now we lined this up with a parabolic total revenue curve or rainbow. Remember that total revenue was highest when demand was unitary. And we looked at how these graphs function together. Remember that if you lower your price in the elastic range, your total revenue is going to increase. All right guys, so that's just a quick review of some of the things that we covered in Unit 3 of microeconomics. So until later, bye.